Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to switch tack slightly. Firstly, I'll be coming back to talking about North American cities, specifically research that I've started recently in Ottawa itself, and we'll be doing over the next 2-3 years. And I'm also going to sort of come back to a point that Matt Hoffman made yesterday, which is to contrast a framing of climate policy and politics in terms of an emissions problem, and to reframe it as a transformation or a transitions problem. And so in a way, thinking about what, say, Elizabeth was saying at the beginning of the panel, where you start by looking at a city and you measure all the policies that they're taking, I'm going to take a step back and say, well, what determines emissions in the first place within cities? And to start to think structurally about how cities work, especially North American cities, and the North American-European contrast is really important, useful in this regard, and then to talk a little bit about research I'm doing in Ottawa at the moment that approaches climate politics in cities from that sort of point of view. In other words, switching from thinking about experimental initiatives to thinking about reshaping urban development as the sort of approach to climate change politics. So if you look at the research on cities, and this is research on cities and climate change, and I'm skating over this literature absurdly quickly, but I would pick out two sorts of forms of research which I've sort of been involved in with Matt Hoffman and people like Harriet Bulkley as well. And one is on transnational city networks, and this is partly because of the global governance story that Matt was talking about yesterday, that we've got a whole set of interesting novel ways that the world is being governed via these networks, and that's an interesting question. Some of those are regional, like the Covenant of Mayors, but some of them are global as well. And the other sort of literature that I think is quite interesting and a reasonable amount of emphasis being put on it is to say, when we look at what cities are doing, other actors as well, but cities in particular, is that what we see is a lot of experimentation. We see a lot of specific initiatives where, in a way, again, sort of coming back to what Elizabeth was saying, people don't know exactly whether it's going to work or not. And you see a lot of people trying out new stuff. And a lot of the literature on this looks at these initiatives where cities around the world are sort of trying projects of solar roofs or particular sorts of buildings regulations, or complete streets would be a good example in the Ottawa context, which is taking off, and other cities as well, where nobody's quite certain in advance, how would you measure what success was with a complete streets policy, for example, in greenhouse gas emissions. It's pretty hard to know whether or not it would gain traction, whether it would sort of scale up, or et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of emphasis on that, precisely because one of the logics of what Matt was talking about yesterday is that nobody really knows how we're going to decarbonise. If the problem is framed as a question of transformation and transition to a low-carbon economy, we actually don't have any empirical evidence of what that looks like. There are no historical analogues, and we don't know what sorts of policies will work to generate it. We have some hints, but it engenders a logic of saying, well, let's try lots and lots of stuff and see, and follow it as it goes along. My aim is to sort of not to undermine those two strands of research about cities and climate change, but what I'm trying to do in the work I'm doing at the moment is to come back to the question of what are the drivers of emissions within cities, and to connect that back to core questions of urban development and the politics of that. And I think that one of the stories that comes out of that is that when we look at that, what we see is enduring contradictions that we need to take account of between the sort of normal pattern of urban development and the attempt to shift to a low-carbon trajectory. So in the Ontario context, and therefore at the city level in Ottawa context, but then one way, this is from the Ontario's climate change policy consultation document about a year ago, we can see here some quite distinctive things when we think about North American cities. In fact, as was alluded to yesterday as well, there's a big contrast between Canadian and American cities because of the role of coal in the electricity sector. So here we see that electricity emissions are tiny. and 9% of the total. And that's because coal has been eliminated, and that's the natural gas component at the end. By contrast, buildings and transport between them account for over 50% of emissions, and those are sort of sources of emissions where cities play an enormous role, not a sole role. It's a multi-level problem, as we've seen, but a very big role in determining those levels of emissions. Ontario's emissions are about 12.5, 13 tonnes per capita, so around 30% higher than the EU average. But when you think that EU average, most EU countries still have coal as a significant part of their electricity mix, that's a significant. That means that the transport question becomes a really, really important driver. And we saw that in other contexts yesterday. That also means at the city level, we've seen some stuff, and we'll see a bit in the second part of these two linked panels, that urban electricity generation can become a significant part of that. But the logic for me of thinking about this is that if you could halve the absolute amount of that transportation emissions, then your problem of having to electrify transport becomes a lot easier. That's a lot less electricity you have to generate, according to what there's along the lines of what James Meadowcroft was saying yesterday. So the general story, when I think we come back to the point that I made at the beginning, when we think about the underlying drivers of emissions in the urban context, is the question of density. So the density of cities is the key sort of structural determinant of urban energy use and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. And the principal reason for there's two sorts of reasons for this. The most important one is that it determines the proportion of journeys made not in a car. So if you look comparatively across cities, well, the North American European comparison is the obvious one. You can do it more globally. Then, whether or not somebody drives an SUV or not, or whether they drive a Fiat 500, is really unimportant. It determines a tiny amount of the variation between, say, European and North American transport-related emissions. What matters is whether you drive to work in a car or not, or you go on your bike or on a tram. So the key reason that urban emissions in a city like Ottawa will be somewhere like twice as high as urban emissions in a city like Amsterdam or Frankfurt was mentioned earlier on. I don't have those figures to hand, but I bet you it's about that. It's about twice as high. Is because is the driving to work question. That's the principal reason that is the case. So here, for example, you've got a chart which is the urban density of inhabitants per hectare along the bottom, and going up there's the amount of it's only the transport-related energy consumption per capita, and you see a pretty tight relationship there. The blue cities are the European ones, the yellow cities are North American ones, and the pink ones are Australian, which are more like the North American pattern. And so the more people you have per hectare, the lower your energy use is going to be. It's a fairly straightforward relationship, reasonably well established. The second thing that density has an influence on is on housing-related emissions, or housing-related energy use, and therefore emissions. And this is because of, on the one hand, of house size, just smaller houses, and on the other hand, of housing type. So row houses have lower emissions. Row houses and apartments have lower energy use than single-family houses. And so here, this is not as big an effect as it is with transport, but nevertheless, here you see sort of 4 or 5 different types of dwelling, which contain both the question of the location, are they suburban or in an urban core, and are they sort of green buildings or non-green buildings. And you see that even amongst, if you compare with the urban average in the middle, even if you compare suburban green buildings with urban green buildings, you see that there's significantly lower emissions, both in the transport sector, but also in the housing energy use themselves. So density is key. So therefore, to think about that is in the context of relatively low density cities like most North American ones, not all, but most, then increasing density has to be seen, to my mind, as a key device for pursuing low carbon development. This is actually, this is at one level already recognised. Most cities, including the city of Ottawa, have an explicit target to increase their density, even without necessarily having climate change or carbon as a key driver of that aim. You know, it's partly to do with, it's also very expensive to build out in the suburbs. You know, the amount of infrastructure you have to build is much higher cost, and there's all sorts of other social costs of that sort of low density development. But what happens, and this is the research I'm doing, I'm going to just talk briefly about now, is that the question then, to my mind, becomes the political question, the policy question, is what happens when we try and do that, when we try and increase density. And so exploring that process, whether or not people talk about climate change in that process or not, is really useful as an indicator for saying what are going to be the challenges in pursuing low carbon urban development. And so with an MSc student last year at the university, I collected along that lines the news data of all conflicts over intensification projects in Ottawa between 2001 and 2014. David Chenishenko's smiling because his name comes up quite a lot in those. And your name's going to come up in a minute. And so that was as a useful site to explore the character of the conflicts, the values, the desires, the fears that are invoked, both and operated sort of barriers and also sometimes motivations to enable a shift to a higher density city. And there are three sorts of stories that I would draw out of this research. Now, I'm not going to present the data in a lot of detail, but three sorts of stories I want to bring out of that. Firstly, the conflicts are concentrated in the urban core, right? And there's a very significant urban-suburban conflict over intensification. This is of the 800 or so news articles that we looked at. These are the wards in Ottawa. Sorry, apologies for people who are not familiar with Ottawa, but basically Somerset Ward, Rideau-Vanier, Capital Ward, which is where David Chenishenko goes the councillor for, and Kitchissippi Ward account for around 70% of all the news articles of the projects that are mentioned in the news articles, not the number of articles themselves. And those are the four inner city wards. Interestingly, what you get on the urban-suburban thing is a significant number of complaints about differential treatment. So when you get a project out, I can think of a project in Kanata North, for example, at 1131 Terran Road, for anybody who wants to, who knows of that particular one, is local, where there was a significant element where it was reasonably explicitly stated by a number of councillors that essentially what was happening was that suburban councillors were ganging up and objecting to projects that they were foisting on people in the urban core. Now, if you want to think about the density of the city as a whole, if you want to think about that transportation problem, then all areas of the city need to become more dense. But what is happening is you're getting a concentration of the projects in the already relatively dense parts of the city, in the middle. So that's one observation. The second observation is, if you like, that the political economy of intensification is the same as the political economy of sprawl. And what do I mean by that? That is that the pattern of relationships between city councillors, developers, city officials, and the decision-making process is identical. And so that if you think about there's a huge literature on the history of sprawl and urban planning in North American cities, then a pattern of relationship of where developers buy up land on the edge of a city, they lobby to get that land rezoned as for residential use. They build a subdivision. They realise a profit at the moment the rezoning occurs because the value of the land goes up enormously. Then they build and they sell it. So there's a dynamic there, and that those same developers are the single biggest contributors to local politicians' campaign funds, which is still the case. Right? And so you've got a relationship there built into the planning process or the politics of the planning process, which favoured sprawl. When you look at the intensification projects that appear in our database, at least, then the dynamic is actually identical, the same. And you've got developers sitting there from development companies in Ottawa saying, well, when they announced intensification as a policy, basically we just looked at the spots that would be good for that, and we started buying up land. And we did the same thing, and we got it rezoned, and then we lobbied to say, well, we need to be able to build a 20-storey condo instead of an 8-storey condo because that's how we'll maximise the amount of money, et cetera, et cetera. And so on the one hand, you have a very passive planning process. Planning in North American cities is basically a zoning process, not a planning process. I think European planners come and look and say, you're not actually planning, guys. You're just saying you can do this here and that there. You're not saying what the city is going to become, how the city is going to change. And so there's that, what it is to plan, and then there's that relationship between land ownership, property developers, and so on, which is built in. And that, of course, determines the character of that intensification, because it's being what is being built where is being determined by the profit margins of the developers more than any other particular factor. And the other thing, and that comes out very clearly in the stories that we've looked at so far. And the second one, and I think so that's the political economy in the narrow sense. The second one I think is a more interesting one, is when you add in the sort of cultural question as well. And there's a whole load of specifics to do this about when people invoke notions of heritage. They invoke questions. I mean, in one of the statements, somebody says there's a human right not to have the character of one's neighbourhood changed, which is quite a strong claim. But anyway. But the character of the neighbourhood becomes an important sort of cultural story about why you want to resist any given project. But I think essentially what you've got is two competing visions of intensification. For those you know your traditions in sort of urban studies, I would call these Le Corbusier against Jane Jacobs. And so a sort of high modernist, taller is better, glass and steel sort of vision, which the developing companies tend to evoke, and we've got developers in there saying, well, a 12-story building's really boring. You need to build 20 for it to be really exciting. And so they get actually, actively enthusiastic about questions like height, rather than whereas height for lots of other people is precisely what they object to. Versus the Jane Jacobs sort of tradition, especially in North American planning from the 60s onwards, favouring sort of lower rise, maybe a maximum of about 8 stories, dense neighbourhoods, walkable neighbourhoods, etc., mixed use, etc., etc., etc. The important point to my mind about this is that it is the question of ambivalence. Because the people, and David may say exactly something like this, confirming this in half an hour or so when he's on, but he definitely says that in some of the news articles we read, that you've got a sort of espousal of the Jane Jacobs vision, which is in favour of high-density urban living, mixed use, etc., walkable neighbourhoods, and so on and so on. So in favour of intensification, but opposing the sort of high-rise condos at the same time. And so what these competing cultural visions of intensification produce is that a weird situation where the councillors, who are the ciphers in our stories, I'm not picking on them, but it's just that they appear a lot because that's who the journalists go and ask for an opinion, and they're responsible for sort of representing their constituents. But the people who are most rhetorically in favour of doing things about climate change in cities are the most likely people to oppose any given intensification project. And so I think that speaks a bit to like what Stephen Hill was talking about yesterday, that we've got a sort of many of us have a sort of conflicted, competing versions of environmentalism in ourselves going on, and that ambivalence I think is a really important thing to explore and try and tease out to enable to open up space to get low carbon development. And so in our stories, the people who come up most frequently, the names who come up opposing individual projects most frequently are David Chernishenko, Clive Doucette and Diane Holmes, who are also the most likely people to be in favour. And David will talk about his 100% renewables vision for the city of Ottawa, I'm sure, in a bit. They're the most likely to be in that sort of political space. And that's an interesting paradox, I think, to try and understand if we're going to open up space to get low-carbon development in North American cities. And that's what I just said. So. Okay.